I think that leadership is difficult, but it's not complicated. I was getting paid very well. I had a young family. I had a mortgage. I was afraid of stepping out of that job.
Chris Hirst boasts over a decade of experience in global and UK CEO positions and is widely acknowledged as an innovative and inspirational leader. Chris is also the author of the best-selling and award-winning book No Bullshit Leadership and No Bullshit Change.
I did get lucky. I made the most of my luck when it came along. The businesses only exist in two phases. They are either going up or they're going down. I don't think there's a sort of a nice bump along in the middle. For me, a leader is anybody that has people they're responsible for.
Chris,
Hi.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Chris, what is your mission?
Goodness. Well, if you'd have asked me that question about 2 months ago, I really think I wouldn't have had a clue what the answer to that question was. But I feel like over the past couple of months, I've had a bit of a Damascene conversion. And I think my mission is to transform, I'm going to go big, transform society's understanding of what leadership is and who leaders are. Because, you know, in that time of running businesses, and I worked mainly in marketing services, so I experienced the businesses that I worked in, and I experienced our clients' businesses as well. And what I came to believe was that if you go and meet any business, or indeed any department in any business, or any team in any department in any business, when they have challenges and when they have problems, and all businesses and teams have challenges and problems all the time, if you pick away at those problems, like peeling away the skin of an onion, what you discover is that the problem's always the same. The problem in some shape or form is always leadership. It's always leadership. And the only solution to that problem is better leadership. Not necessarily different leaders, sometimes it's different leaders, but it's certainly a better understanding of leadership. And I think that many people and many organizations don't really understand who leaders are and don't really understand what leadership is.
What were you like as a child?
I think I was quite bossy, but also quite bookish. I was quite an academic child. I was a SWAT, I suppose, as a child, until about the age of 16. And then at the age of 16, I kind of got bored with being bookish and academic and kind of behaved, I suppose, more like a normal teenager, whatever that might mean.
Did you go to uni?
I did go to uni, yeah.
What did you do?
I did engineering science.
Nice.
Because basically, I said I was quite an academic child, so I'm old enough to have done O-levels, and I got good O-levels, so I could choose whichever A-levels I wanted to do, and I, being 16 at that point and deciding I didn't want to be too academic anymore, I chose the A-levels that I thought would require least work and least effort from me, and I was good at maths, so I did pure maths, applied maths and physics, and if you do pure maths, applied maths and physics, you then realise you really limit your degree opportunities, and so I ended up doing engineering.
Okay, a lot of great leaders I've met, they usually leave school at a very early age. What makes you different from those guys?
Well, I definitely didn't leave school at an early age. I mean, I was 24 by the time I'd done school and done a 4-year degree and had a year out. I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, I think there are people who are very successful leaders who... it's an interesting observation. My view is there isn't a leadership type. So my view is there isn't a way you can say, okay, well, really successful leaders are people that leave school at 16, or really successful leaders are people that do MBAs at Harvard. I don't think that's the way to understand leadership. I think that leadership is difficult, but it's not complicated. And I think that the idea that there is a leadership type suggests that it is beyond our control. Like, if there's a leadership type, you can't choose what sort of personality you are, right? So to say there's a leadership type means that from birth there's some greater power has decided you're going to be a leader, you're not. And I think that's an unbelievably disempowering way to view the world. I fundamentally believe that we are in control of our own destinies. And one of the things that I really want to upend in terms of our understanding of leadership is that it's difficult, but it's not complicated. Everybody can learn the skills of leadership. Everybody can. That's not to say that everybody necessarily can reach the same level of ability at it, in the same way that if we all in this room took up a musical instrument, if we all had good tuition and practiced hard, we'd all get a lot better, but some people would progress faster than others. It's the same as any skill. But I really believe that, this fallacy that there's a leadership type, or that it's some secret knowledge available only to a chosen few, or you have to have gone to an expensive business school to understand it, I think inhibits people who are already in leadership positions from fulfilling their potential, because there's all this bullshit in the way. And I think even worse than that, I think it excludes whole swathes of society from thinking that leadership is at all relevant to them. And I think that's to our individual detriment, and I think that's to societal detriment.
Awesome. I always say failure is my best friend. What was your first failure?
Oh, I don't know what I couldn't tell. I don't know what my first failure would be. I mean, we fail all the time. I can tell you what my most notable failure was.
Yes, please.
Okay. I was a very ambitious. I always have been a very ambitious person. I'm sure that I've got that in common with everybody in the room here. And at the age of 32, I was made managing director of an advertising agency as one of an entirely new leadership team. I was hired by the CEO. There was 4 of us, and this agency was a dog of a business. It was an unfixable, broken business. And we looked at each other, and we were all young and idiots, basically, I think, with hindsight. And we looked at each other and thought, well, I'm really good, and these people are all really good, so done. This is like going to be a cakewalk. And within 6 months, the guy that hired us had been fired in a blaze of, whatever the opposite of blaze of glory is. And within 2 years, the other people I'd been hired with had all left, and by the way, gone on to stellar careers, because they were very talented. But for various reasons, I didn't. And I stayed for 6 years, and I was passed over repeatedly to be the CEO. I was the permanent number 2 in this business. And I'd been hired as part of the solution. And 6 years later, I was still there. The business was still a crap business. And if you're still there and the business is still a crap business after 6 years, you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And I was pretty sure, with some good justification, that I had completely screwed my career at this point. And I think I kind of got lucky. Now you could say, okay, we make our own luck, but nevertheless, I got lucky. And I was passed over yet again to be CEO, which I was very resentful about. They may have been right to pass me over, by the way, but I was very resentful about it. And said, I'm going to leave. And they, for various reasons, didn't want me to leave at that point. And I said, well, I'll stay if you'll pay for me to go and do the advanced management program at Harvard, which is an 8-week executive program at Harvard. And this program changed my life, but it didn't change my life for the ways that you think that going to Harvard might change your life. It's not that I learned anything anything academic that changed me. What happened was I got taken away from my family. It was in Boston, so I got taken away from my family, from my friends, from my job, and I got plonked in a different city where I knew everybody for 8 weeks. And I realized when I walked into the classroom in Harvard that I could be whoever I pretended to be in that room. I wasn't Chris, who'd screwed his career working for a shit agency and was going nowhere, and people were kind of a lot of sneering behind their hands at me, or at least I thought people were. I could be anybody I wanted to be. And I realized that it's just all stories in our head. All the things we believe about ourselves are just stories we tell ourselves. And so for 8 weeks, I was able to tell myself a different story. It completely changed me as a person. And I think I was lucky. And I don't think you have to have gone to Harvard to have that experience, but that was how I managed to have that experience.
A lot of people handle failure differently. What do you think is the best way to handle failure?
Well, I got 2 observations about it. I think people talk about, we had a chat about it before, everybody likes talking about failures, but one of the things I'd say is that it's always kind of entertaining and interesting and maybe inspiring to talk about failures that have happened in the past. But when it's happening to you in the moment, certainly this is my experience, I can't speak for everybody, but my experience is when it's happening to me in the moment, it's really horrible. Okay, so it can be a very deep hole to be in, I think, when it's happening to you right there and then. That's certainly how I've felt when it happens to me. But I also think that it is true that I think that it's not just that if you want to achieve something great in your life, whatever that might be, I don't think that failure's just an occupational hazard. I think it's a prerequisite for success. I don't think it's possible to achieve anything really great. Perhaps it's not even possible to achieve anything distinctly average, maybe. That's hard enough. It's not possible to achieve anything without failing along the way. And I think if you buy that argument, I think has quite an interesting implication, because if you're running a business, if you believe that and you're running a business, maybe you should say to yourselves, are we failing enough? If we're never failing, then maybe we're never trying. Because if you really do believe that greatness requires failure along the way, then you have to fail to get there. Nothing ever happens in a straight line in the real world. Nothing ever starts with we're at 0 and we're going to go to 100 and it's just going to go straight up there. This is a room full of entrepreneurs. I mean, I'm telling people in this room that know this way better than I do.
Okay, so leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Leadership. You said I watched a workshop of yours, and you said leadership is not just about having people work under you. Leadership is a process, is a journey. Tell us a little bit about that and your equation for that as well.
Yeah, okay. So I think I wrote a book about leadership, and I think if you're going to write a book about leadership, you have to ask yourself, or at least I felt I had to ask myself 2 questions first. Question 1 was, what's a leader? And question 2 was, what is leadership? So I thought, well, if it's my book, I'm going to try and define those things. And for me, a leader is anybody that has people they're responsible for. And that is to understand my view on leadership, I think that's the start point. Because that's a far, far, far broader definition of leadership than we usually accept. Normally, if you say leader, people think successful entrepreneurs, CEOs, whatever it is. But by that definition, that means that everybody in this room has been a leader from very early in their careers. It also means if you run businesses of any size, you've got multiple leaders working for you within your organizations. And yet, most people and most organizations don't think of themselves as leaders when they're in those positions, and yet they are the most important people in the working lives of the people they're responsible for. I mean, I remember I had people I was responsible for after about 18 months of starting like a proper job. And you know, I was way more important in those people's lives than the CEO, who none of us ever met. And the second definition is leadership. And so for me, leadership is the navigation of a group of people from a defined point in the present, and that's important. We need to understand our start point, to a different and clearly defined state that exists in the future. So we have to define our start point. We have to know where we're starting from. You can't solve a problem if you don't understand where you're starting, what it is. And you're not leading if you're not clear where you're getting to. I mean, just going somewhere else isn't leading. Leading is about getting from between 2 defined places. But defining, very often I think when people think about leadership, and I've been guilty of this, and I see a huge industry that I refer to as the leadership industrial complex makes billions of dollars from this. We're often told that leadership is the defining of those 2 points. So this huge industry around visions and values and objectives and purposes, I mean, those things matter, but they're not leadership. You have to know where you're getting to, but knowing where you're getting to isn't leading. Leading is getting there. So my argument is defining where you are today isn't a difficult question to answer. You shouldn't treat it as such. Where you're trying to get to usually isn't that difficult a question, not a trivial question, but it's not that difficult a question. Getting between the 2 is leadership, and that is difficult. And the way you get between the 2 is you act. I mean, these all things are obvious. So I said to you before, I did a degree in engineering. I did 2 maths A-levels, so I like an equation. So I thought, well, I'll write an equation for leadership. So my equation for leadership is leadership impact equals clarity multiplied by action. We need to be clear what we're trying to achieve. But the point really of the equation is that my belief is that most leaders fail not because they don't come up with clever strategies and not because they don't write lots of very intelligent PowerPoint presentations. They fail because they don't get stuff done. So the point of the equation, you don't have to have done two maths A levels to know that anything multiplied by 0 equals 0. The point of the equation is, no matter how great your strategy is, no matter how great your clarity is, if your action is 0, your impact is 0. And I think this is the most common reason for leadership failure, because getting stuff done is really hard. And we've talked about failure, and why is it hard? Well, one of the reasons it's hard is because that's when you can actually fail and be seen to fail.
Could you give us an example of like a case study of something that you've experienced? Because a lot of the time when you're a leader, it's the people that ultimately drive the business forward, right?
100% people.
So firstly, what does relationships mean to you? And secondly, give us an example of a time that you went through some struggles and you overcame it.
Well, I mean, I think so there's two quite different questions there. So I'll do the struggles bit first. Well, I think the best example of that in my career was the example I gave you when I had, and I had really it was a dark 6 years. You know, I mean, I was an ambitious person. I am an ambitious person, and I asked myself why I stayed in that job for that period of time, and I think I stayed in that job because I was afraid. You know, I was getting paid very well. I had a young family. I had a mortgage. I was afraid of stepping out of that job, and afraid of the implications of what, if you like, taking a step back in order to take 2 steps forward meant. And so I became like the frog in warming water, you know, and gradually my situation deteriorated, and in the end I think I did get lucky. I made the most of my luck when it came along, but I got lucky. What was your second question?
What does relationships mean to you?
Can you expand on
So when you're a leader and you have people working for you, ultimately they are really delicate relationships.
Yeah.
And you have to be empathetic, you have to understand what they are doing in their personal life, how does that then connect to how they are delivering in their job or their, you know, whatever business. How do you handle that?
Well, I think I'll maybe give that. I'll try and answer that on a sort of individual level and then a kind of a macro level, if that makes sense. So I'm going to start big and then I'm going to go small. So I think one of the most important things. Sometimes I think the most important thing, but it depends what day you ask me, that one of the most important things that effective leaders do is they create effective cultures. Now, as soon as I mention the word culture, 50% of the room's eyes kind of glaze over because it's this sort of abused word, right? I mean, every team has a culture, every school sports team, every organization has values that it puts on its website and all that kind of stuff. And the reason our eyes glaze over is because the reason we're cynical about the word is because cynicism exists in the gap between what we say and what we do, right? The bigger the gap between what we say and what we do, the bigger the cynicism. And in many organizations, the gap between what they say their culture is and what we know the real culture is very wide indeed. But nevertheless, I think the ability to create an effective culture, so I defined culture. So, okay, I'm going to write about culture. What is culture? Culture for me is the environment a leader creates for their teams to outperform. In effective cultures, teams and individuals achieve things they wouldn't otherwise achieve. And again, that's in some ways an obvious statement, because you could say, well, if people aren't achieving things they wouldn't otherwise achieve, if they aren't managing that, then why is the leader there at all? And we've all worked with people, by the way, that's a valid question. Why are those people there? So what good people do, good leaders do, is they create an environment where people achieve things they wouldn't otherwise achieve. And one of the ways they do that is by creating a culture that enables people to perform at a level above where they would otherwise perform. We see this in sports teams, right? And it applies in all teams. So I think one of the culture is primarily about behaviours, not values. That's why I don't think there's anything wrong with organisations defining themselves in terms of values, but I think values are very hard to do anything with if you're actually working there, whereas behaviours are very tangible. And so culture ultimately is the behaviour of the leader. That's what real culture is. That's all it is. You can write down whatever you like, but culture is the behaviour of the leaders. And in good organisations, what they say matters to them is how the leadership team behave. That's how to do it. It's not easy, leadership isn't, but that's what it is. And therefore, when people say culture is difficult to change, yes and no, it's if you change your behaviours as a leader, the culture will change. But that I think is what culture is now, and that's why in organisations of any size, if you're a very small organisation, maybe you do have a homogenous culture. Maybe if there's 20 people, you're small enough to have a homogenous culture. But if you're an organisation of 200 people, you'll have multiple leaders in that organisation, and therefore you'll have multiple cultures. You'll have multiple cultures. There might be a red thread that connects them, but as soon as you have different leaders, within those teams that those leaders run, the cultures in those teams will be different, which is why different teams perform at different levels. So, that's it. So if you are a leader, one of the things you really, I think the basic unit of an organisation is not an individual, it's a team. That for me is the basic unit of an organisation. It's built on teams. And so as a leader, you have to build effective cultures and teams, and that's partly to do with relationships with people. So I think, I think that you have to be, my view is, the relationship with the people is you need to be authentic, you need to be consistent, you need to be clear. I always feel like one of the greatest things that you can do when running a team is give people the appropriate levels of autonomy. What people want is certainly what ambitious people want, and we all want to employ ambitious people, I think, is autonomy. Daniel Pink wrote a book called Drive, and he talks about this a lot. But giving people a greater sense of autonomy is one of the best ways of enabling people to find their own sense of purpose, frankly reduce their levels of stress, because one of the reasons we feel stress at work is we have responsibility without control. We feel high levels of responsibility, but we aren't able to control how we work. So I think the ability of leaders to help people take greater control over how they work, which is what autonomy means, is a great way to build great teams. This is a very long answer to your question, but it's quite a big question. But I think you can only get to that by having good, effective, collective relationships with teams, but also individual relationships with the people in the team, because everybody wants slightly different things. And as a leader, that's why the amount of direct reports you have, etc., matter. There's only so many people you can have close relationships with.
Right. So let's kind of come out of what leaders do in terms of culture. How do you look after yourself? How do you make yourself the best version of yourself?
So I think I was pretty bad at that for a long time, and I didn't look after myself, in truth, I think, but I think I've learned to be better at it. I was lucky in that I don't think I ever actually made myself ill as a result of that, and I know that people do, and it is possible to do that. But nevertheless, I think that I've come to believe that what we need to do as organisations and individuals is be really clear about what are the things that we identifying the areas that we can spend our time that will make the most difference. It's very easy to be busy. It's very easy to fill our days being busy, but it's less easy to be effective. And I think one of the things that work does is it fills our days with a lot of stuff that, frankly, if it didn't get done, nobody would ever notice. And that's why a lot of organisations, you can turn up, even as a very senior person, and spend a lot of time on autopilot. And so I started to be, I used to say advertising agencies, advertising networks, which is what I ran, I like federations. They're federations of small businesses, really. So I had probably 100 CEOs working for me at one point. And one of the things I would say to some of those CEOs is be more like me, be lazier. And it's a rather counterintuitive thing to say to an agency CEO. But what I meant was I wanted those people to restrict the amount of time that they allowed themselves and force them to focus on the areas that really mattered, and force them to give away more of what they were doing themselves to the people that work for them. So identify the areas that you can only you can do and where you can make most difference. So which allows you, I think, to just work less hours. So I forced myself to work less hours. I got better at delegating, and I, you know, I'm the sort of person that I don't recover by, sure, like everybody in the room. I'm going to recover by just lying and watching telly. I go and play. I'm an active person. I play tennis. The best way for me to switch off is to go and do an activity where my brain is so consumed by it, I haven't got time to think of all those things over there that were stressing me at work. And for anybody that plays tennis, is a sufficiently difficult sport that you haven't got any space in your brain to think about anything else. And you know, a great hour and a half of that is the best sort of recovery for me.
Yeah, this is. To be honest, I've known about you for about 2 weeks, and I watched your stuff, and I'm a big believer in authenticity. And you're so authentic, and this is why I love everything you say. It really, really hits me in a way which I want to learn, and I want to bring it to life. Where are you right now in your journey? What are you doing right now?
So 2 years ago, I was the global CEO of a big advertising agency group, and I lost my job. And I haven't really talked about this. I mean, I've talked to people privately, but I haven't really talked publicly about this. And it was a very, you know, it was a complete shock. And it was a shock that lasted a long time. It really was really, really hard. And at that point, I realised that I'm an organised person. So at that point, I realised I'd been in either full-time education or full-time employment because I knew what job I was going to do before I graduated from university. I worked in my year out. I didn't go and swan around like Thailand. I worked in a factory in St Helens. So from the age of 4 to when I lost my job, I'd been in full-time education or full-time employment. And suddenly, like, I woke up and I go, I don't even know who I am. And so I had to go through a long process of just dealing with that, and go through quite a long process of actually thinking maybe there are other ways to spend my time, maybe there are other ways to make a living, maybe there are other ways to find personal fulfillment than going and getting a conventional job, which is what I'd always done to that point. But that's an easy thing to say, but it's quite a difficult thing to do. But that's where I am now, and I was talking to people earlier. You know, I haven't yet got to a point where I've got like a really sharp answer to that question. But it's less blurry than it was. It was very blurry 6 months ago, and what I'm really passionate about is I hope this has come across. I'm really passionate about the power of effective leadership to transform lives and to transform organisations. I have, you know, and I think that is not, and I'm particularly passionate about this concept of being an everyday leader. And by that, I mean not just leadership like sitting and, I don't want to be a coach, right? I don't want to, that's not me. Coaches are great and important, it's just not me. You know, I want to make mass change. I want to help people from, you know, people who are still at school understand what leadership is and why understanding it will help them be better at fulfilling their own dreams and ambitions. And frankly, if you care about other people, if you care about helping other people, the way you do that is learn to lead. I mean, that's what leadership is about. Leadership is all about other people.
What is the difference between what
you do and a coach? What's the difference?
I think coaching is a kind of business therapy, and that's got a pretty, I mean, that's important. I'm not saying that in a dismissive way, but I think that's what a lot of coaching is. And I think it's typically a very one-on-one exercise with an individual. And I'm interested in organizational change. I'm interested in large groups of people and large organizations or large movements. I'm interested in helping thousands, hundreds of thousands of people change and fulfill whatever it is they want to fulfill.
No bullshit change.
Mm-hmm.
What was that about?
Well, so I wrote a book called No Bullshit Leadership, and I think that leadership's an input and change is an output is basically how I see the two. All leadership is about movement, all leadership is about change. And I suppose I built the second half of my career on taking broken businesses and fixing them. And I did that through, and in a sense, that 6 years of failure that I've talked about, that is probably the greatest period of learning I've ever had. It didn't feel like it at the time, by the way, but once I became a CEO, the one thing I knew with absolute total crystal clarity, I didn't know what we were going to do. I didn't have a crystal clear plan for how we were going to do it, but I was absolutely, totally clear that I wasn't going to make the mistakes that I had made and I'd seen others make for the preceding 6 years. I knew we were going to make mistakes, but we were going to make mistakes all of our own. And we were hugely successful. I mean, we really did change that business, and then I went and took those same principles and took them to Havas. And I think that businesses only exist in two phases. They are either going up or they're going down. I don't think there's a sort of a nice bump along in the middle. You're either moving forward or you're moving backwards. Therefore, if you're leading change. And so the book is a no bullshit program. It's an 8-step program for how to change your business or change your team. Or, I mean, I don't want to stretch analogy too far, but certainly aspects of your life, I suppose.
Could you give us some techniques?
Yeah, I think one of the most common challenges with change is organizations or teams are nearly always not in denial about the challenges they have. Okay, it's the old cliche about if you want to understand the challenges a retailer has, go and talk to the person at the checkout. You want to understand the challenges a factory has, go and talk to the people on the factory floor. So organizations generally understand, throughout the organization, they understand the need to change. It's just the problem is the doing of it. And actually a lot of people, even if they conceptually understand, yes, change would be a good thing, it would be good if we were better than we are today, people nevertheless can see a whole load of personal threat and danger around it. And I think what leaders often do is they'll look at an organization, they'll look at if you like a dashboard or whatever language you want to use, and they'll see all of the things in the organization that need or that could be improved. And what leaders set about doing, they work incredibly hard, they do all the things the business books say they should do, and they set about trying to change and improve all of those things. And there's a concept called Schwerpunkt. Some of you may or might not know it. Bring a bit of German into the room. And it's a German word, and it means point of maximum pressure. And it's from the Napoleonic Wars, as it happens. But anyway, we'll move on from that. I also quite like history. We can talk about history if you like. And the idea of it is that you put the majority or all of the majority of your forces, rather than all line up in a big long line opposite the enemy and all push equally hard at every point. What you do is you put your maximum pressure against a point of your choosing or a point of weakness for your opponent. And I think this is what leaders of change need to do. Leaders of change need to understand what is the single thing that is going to move us most rapidly forward. It may not get us all the way to where we need to get to. It certainly won't solve all of our problems, but we need to focus disproportionately on one area. And if you do that, it's incredibly clarifying, because of course it's not just you that needs to know that, the whole organization needs to know that. This is the thing that we are going to become brilliant at. Now, on one level, this is prioritization. People kind of go, yeah, okay, it's just like a fancy way of talking about prioritization. But what people often do with prioritization is they have no difficulty at all understanding the thing that is most important, but they carry on doing everything else as well. And prioritization only counts if you stop doing a load of stuff. And it's a hard thing to do if you're in charge of a team or a business, because all the things you've ever been told are God, don't stop doing any of those things. But you do have to. You have to, if you're really going to, change is about urgency. Change is about a shock. I imagine that, I've stood many times in front of broken organisations, and I've turned up. Maybe I'm not even based in the country, and in ICARM, and I stand in front of them, and I see all the faces looking at me, and the first thing you need to make people believe in the audience, in the team, in the organisation, is not that change is necessary. People are not in denial about where an organisation sits. You've got to make them believe that you're going to make it happen. That's the first thing you have to do. You have to make people believe that you're gonna do it. And so I imagine it as being a bit like being tethered to a post driven into the ground. You're the CEO, tethered to the post driven into the ground. And the first thing you have to do as a leader of change is you just got to get free. Direction doesn't matter too much. You've got to create space for change to start to happen. So you've just got to smash, honestly, it's like breaking concrete. The first thing you have to do is you have to make people think, Christ, things are a bit different around here. We're not too sure where we're going to end up, or we're not too sure, whether this is all going to work out, but blimey, something's happened. And Schwerpunkt's a bit of that. You've got to break free, and you've got to focus your energies on a single point, at least initially.
What are you going to do? What does the future hold? What does the next 12 months to 2 years look like?
Well, that's the bit that's still a little bit fuzzy. But I think that I've got what I describe to people as a lot of inventory. I've got a lot of stuff that I think is good and useful stuff in the leadership, in the change, and in the career space. And at the moment, those have manifested themselves as books, basically. And that's okay. I mean, people have bought those books, but what I want to do is I want to find ways to be a whole lot more noisy and a whole lot more impactful around that. And so it's interesting, your question about why not, what's the difference between a coach. It's a good way of thinking about it. I want to be the mass version of that. And so I have to push myself quite a long way out of my comfort zone if I'm going to make that happen, but that's what I'm going to try and do.
Awesome, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of role to play to help you do that.
Hopefully, yeah.
As one club.
If anybody can think of a better answer to that question, starters.
Okay, cool. I want to open it to the audience for some questions because we do have a lot of entrepreneurs here, people extremely successful here, and also people who's just starting up as well. So yeah, let's open up to the audience.
Sure.
For questions.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with Mission Command.
Yes.
So
yes.
Just for anybody else, it's the idea of giving people your intent rather than telling them what to do.
Yeah.
None of what you said has sort of been not consistent with that. I just wonder if you had any view on that. That's something that I promoted during that I've learned through my career. I wonder what your views on that were.
So I wrote a little bit about that in my first book. So it's the difference. It's, I suppose, in a military sense. Correct me. In a military sense, it's the difference between saying, okay, we're going to go and take that hill. So you're clear about the objective is, okay, the enemy are on that hill, we're going to go and take that hill. So it's the difference between, and then telling the troops exactly all the stages that you want them to follow in order to get there, versus setting them the objective and allowing the people on the ground to work out the best way to do it. Is that a reasonable attempt to describe that? Yeah. Yes. And I think I think that is exactly what I think effective leadership is. Basically, yes. One of the things that for me, it's a bit like turning the traditional organizational hierarchy upside down. So, traditional organizational hierarchy is you have the important people at the top and information basically flows downwards to the people at the bottom. But the reality of it is in many organizations, the people at the bottom are the people that are actually ones dealing with your customers or your clients. So actually, perhaps the information should flow the other way. They're the ones that actually know what their customers and clients want. They're the ones that are dealing with the problems and the barriers that the organisation puts in its way, because all organisations get in their own way. And I think if I was to write my first book again, I would include a chapter on communication. The more I think about it, the more I think that great communication is an absolutely indispensable skill for effective leaders. I mean, it seems obvious now I'm saying it, but an indispensable skill for effective leaders, but also a critical attribute of effective cultures. Effective cultures are great at communicating with each other. And I mean that communication in all senses. I mean that in a formal sense, an informal sense. I mean by email, I mean by phone call, I mean by WhatsApp. They're great at talking to each other. And so many organizations will talk about, a great idea can come from anywhere. But I mean, it's like saying it's okay to fail. I mean, it's almost a joke in a lot of organizations, right? I mean, those things just aren't true. And yet, in organizations that can communicate effectively, they are true. And again, communication is being an effective communicator is one of those many things that exist in business that is not very difficult to do well. We're not talking about you have to be able to write like Hemingway. It's just being able to say, and a key part of that is, of course, difficult conversations. The conversations that matter most are the difficult conversations, because just because somebody isn't saying something, it doesn't mean that it's not being thought. And that's where that's where cultures start to fall apart. That's where you get politics in organisations, those kind of things. So, yeah, I completely agree. Hi.
Hello. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah. Thank you for your insights, and I really enjoyed the speech. My question is about the emotions behind being a leader, because what I believe, especially when you become a leader, you have the highs, but also the lows and the responsibility on that side. If you look at Elon, if some of the rockets blow up, then it goes down to him. If something happens with Meta, you look at Mark Zuckerberg. So my question is, how do you manage the emotional roller coaster and be able to keep the vision going and be able to even have hard conversations from not a logical point of view, but just an emotional point of view, and how people can benefit from tactics and ways to approach it? Thank you.
Well, I've got a slightly controversial answer to that, which is I read a piece in one of the papers recently, and it was something saying Gen Z, or one of the gens anyway. Let's say Gen Z anyway, Gen A, something. Don't want to get promoted because they don't want the stress. That was the headline of the article, right? And I think this is an example of boss bullshit. Okay, I think that bosses like people to believe that the more senior you get, the more stressful your job is, and I think that's bullshit. And the reason I think that's bullshit is because I became a CEO, which means that I did all the jobs along the way to get there, and it's not stress-free being a CEO, but I enjoyed it more than any of the other jobs along the way. And I think the reason, I say to people, if you want to be able to take control of your personal stress, the best way to do that is to get promoted, because the more senior you are, the more you are able to control how you work. And actually, I think I feel like there's good stress and bad stress, right? I mean, it's a room full of entrepreneurs, a room full of people who like the good stress, right? You put yourself out there, you take the risk, you like the adrenaline, but that's a choice to an extent. I think a lot of the negative stress at work is where we feel out of control, where we feel like we can't control how we work. We like I said, it's responsibility without control. And I think one of the best questions, and I say this to every room I meet, one of the best questions that I think everybody should go and ask their boss, it probably is a room full of people that don't have bosses, but imagine if you did. One of the best questions that people should go and ask their boss is, how can you help me take more control over how I work? So for example, I think the tyranny of Microsoft Teams has perhaps freed us a little bit from presenteeism, but the counter effect of that, Microsoft Outlook has put this terrible control over our lives, right? We have more meetings even though they're remote, and so many people can't even control the meetings that go in their diaries, and this is a huge source of stress, and you don't want the people that work for you to be stressed. You want them to be liberated, to be at their best. That's the best answer I can give you to that question. I feel like Elon Musk probably is a lot less stressed than a lot of the people that work for Elon Musk.
Very good. It's good you asked that question, just following on from that. First of all, thanks Hamza, thanks Chris. The question I was going to ask, which you've alluded to, but I just want to go a bit deeper on, is how can leaders balance the need for results and performance with the well-being of the team or the individuals that they're looking after?
Well, I think that's a great question. I can't pretend to have a really pithy short answer to that. I think first of all, as a leader, you have to have both. Even just being cognizant of both of those things, I think, would be a step forward for many leaders and many organisations. I think there's a lot of lip service paid to, let's say well-being, let's say, and I think I do genuinely believe that you, if by tackling the core of it, by helping people to take, for example, greater control over how they work. Work is. If you want to have a successful career, it's going to be stressful. We all know that, right? If the question is can you find the times to recover? And I was lucky enough for a while to spend some time working with Clive Woodward. And Clive Woodward has this idea of what he calls teamship, which in one of the businesses I ran, we instigated. And I think every team could do this, and I think they could do it today. And the principle is super simple. It's the team meets and decides how it wants to work, in the understanding of what the collective objective of that team is. So I worked in an advertising agency. Let's say obviously everybody knows that, okay, we're running Vodafone. What we're here to do is to have a happy client in Vodafone and to grow the business. That's our shared objective. But how we go about doing that is up to us. And we as a leadership team, we didn't really mind how they went about doing it as long as they did it within some parameters. And so the teams would sit and talk about how, and of course, like in any team, there's people at different life stages. There's some people with kids. There's some people want to leave early every now and again to go and play five-a-side football, whatever it is. But they had a conversation amongst themselves as to what were the things, the sort of the things that mattered to them about how they worked, and come to some shared agreements about how they were going to do it. For me, that's a really simple thing that every team could do, and I think that the world that we work in now, I think, is more accepting of people working in different working patterns, and there are some pros and cons of that, I know, but there is more accepting of people working in different ways. And I think one of the frustrations that organisations have with hybrid working is that people aren't having those conversations. Everybody's just making it up for themselves. Okay, whereas if a team sat down and said, hey, this is how we collectively are going to deal with this, I think that people are generally reasonable, right? Most people are reasonable and want to make it work. So I just think that organisations could be more imaginative about finding solutions to that. And perhaps, back to mission control, the best way to do that is to allow teams. I said earlier, I think the basic unit of an organisation is a team, not an individual, is maybe to help empower. It's an eek word, isn't it? Apologies. I've got this far without saying empower. Maybe the best way is that organisations encourage the individual teams to find answers to that rather than impose it top down. But frankly, just having it on the leaders' to-do list makes it more likely that they're going to be good at it. Do you sound convinced? Do you feel convinced by my answer? I'd give myself 6 out of 10 for that answer.
Any more questions? No more? One at the back.
Hey Chris, thanks Chris and Hamza for an excellent discussion.
Thanks.
One of the things that I wanted to inquire into was the extent to which the incentives within the entire organization may not be aligned. So for instance, when you speak about communication being extremely necessary to facilitate a quick transfer of what the values are and therefore decisions to be made effectively, at least in the organizations that I've worked with and seen kind of under the hood what goes on, a lot of the times one organization can almost effectively be multiple different organizations at the same time.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why, like, when a lot of big companies do acquisitions, they'll keep the acquired company as its own kind of separate arm to exist separately because of those different cultures. In your experience, how have you managed that process to make sure that the relevant organizational flows and streams are set up so that all of the incentives match? Because it's only when you have that value match that you'll have communication working properly.
I think that's a really great question. Well, I do think that whether corporations like it or not, and very often they're in denial about it, as I said earlier, there are inevitably multiple different cultures in big organizations. And to an extent, I think that's, well, you might as well encourage it because it's inevitable. You've got different leaders running different teams or different organizations, then you might as well go with it. If you acquire an organization, one of the things you're acquiring is the culture. So I think it's a pretty well established fact that most M&A activity destroys shareholder value. And one of the reasons it destroys shareholder value is because you lose in buying it, you kill the thing you've bought. And of course, if founders leave, for example, founders in an organization are the single most potent driver of that culture. So I do think that's a dilemma. So I think, first of all, you need to organizations just need to accept that there are different cultures. And I think one of the things that organizations don't do is they don't have a good conversation about what culture is. Culture exists whether you like it or not, but most people don't think about it. Most people are unaware of what it really is. Most leaders are unaware of their impact on the culture. I think there's this sort of weird inverse relationship. The more senior people become, the more influential they are on the culture, and yet the further away they are from knowing what the real culture is, because nobody's rude to them, right? So I think there are different cultures. That said, I think if I understand your question rightly, if you've got different, whether they're acquired or not, correct me if I'm misinterpreting your question, but if you've got a corporation that has different divisions or different businesses within it, how do you create some degree of cultural commonality across them? Would that be a summary? Well, I think ultimately that those corporations must have somebody that they report to, and so the person who's responsible for that is that person. So I did pretty well that job at Havas in the UK. So we had like 10 businesses, let's say, in our UK business, and they were spread all over London. Some were good businesses, some were shitty businesses, and my job was to co-locate them. They didn't like that, and to find ways where we could create the whole being greater than some of the parts. The dream, right? It's what everybody wants to achieve, and really the only way we were able to do that was not because of me, but because of my role. They created a role where I had the authority to be able to do that. So I was able to identify what were the things that we had to all have in common. Which didn't mean everything. It just meant that this is about growth. And so the things that we need to agree on are the things that are going to help us grow, for example. The day job piece is, as long as the businesses weren't broken, keep doing what you were doing. But I think it's impossible to do that without having somebody who's got the authority to make it happen. And if you've got the right person with the right authority, that's how. I think a lot of organisations sort of cross their fingers, but unless you have a structure and a person or a team of people, it's never going to happen.
Awesome. Any other questions? Sure.
Thank you. And this is my last question, don't worry. But so you mentioned you had a finance engineering background, so you probably
not finance, just
engineering. Mathematics engineering background,
yeah.
And probably means that you can think in first principles. So as a leader, how has that helped you make decisions? but also use other mental models on a day-to-day basis and your thinking behind of evaluating decisions?
I don't know that engineering has really helped me do that, if I'm really honest. I think that your question about decision making, though, I think that a decision. So I think one of the key things that leaders fail because they don't act, and acting is about taking decisions. And for me, it's a bit like driving, right? No leaders admit to being bad decision makers. Nobody admits to being a bad driver, but if you go and spend 10 minutes on the M6, there's a lot of bad drivers out there. If you spend 10 minutes in any organisation, there's a lot of leaders who are bad decision makers. And by bad, what I mean is not making enough decisions. I don't mean bad decision. I mean, of course, if every decision you make is just disastrous, but most leaders fail because they just don't make enough decisions promptly enough. And they don't make them promptly enough because they wait in the hope that everything will become suddenly clear. And of course it doesn't. And for me, a decision is a choice you take when you're uncertain of the outcome. So by definition, a choice you take when you're uncertain of the outcome. So if you're uncertain of the outcome, sometimes it's not going to work out how you expect. And so leaders, I think, need to reframe being fearful of things not working out how they expect, because guess what? Sometimes they're not going to being fearful about not making enough decisions promptly enough. Because leadership's about taking control. And the way you take control is you take decisions. So good leaders are able, on average, to control events, or rather they can control their direction in spite of events. And bad leaders are at the whim of events. And the way you do that is you take decisions. And I'll finish on this. The best thought I've got for that is Colin Powell, who was the US sort of soldier, statesman, and he had what he called his 40-70 rule. And his 40-70 rule was don't take decisions if you're less than 40% certain. But if you've waited till you're more than 70% certain, you've waited too long. So he said, get used to living in this 40-70 zone, and you've got a chance of being in control.
Love that. Thank you. Big round of applause.